top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Last night, as part of a Golden Boy promotion show, former undisputed welterweight champion turned junior middleweight Cecilia Braekhus returned to action after a lengthy stint of inactivity against Argentina's own Portillo. And you could see that there was ring rust there. You could see that her timing was a bit off and her feet were a little bit heavy. But for the most part, she definitely won the fight. Not a hard fight to score at all. The jab was ever present, and even in her prime.
Yeah, Cecilia was always more of a jabber.
And the jab is what won her this fight. The jab is what won her this thing. The ever-present jab that she kept in Portillo's face, setting up other punches.
Whilst controlling the range with the jab. She landed 3 good right hands off the straight 1-2 towards the tail end of the first round. The second round was a chippier round.
Very messy work from Portillo. Nothing clean. Eating jabs from Cecilia Braekhus. Braekhus, while still measuring and baiting her, waiting to get off a big right hand. Busy with the jab.
Busy with the jab in the second round. Busier overall in the third. Several straight 1-2s landed. Clean shots.
By the third round, Cecilia Braekhus looked a little bit more comfortable than she did in the first 2.
And continued to warm up in the fourth round, looking poised, controlled, and in control.
In control, managing the distance behind the jab on the balls of her feet, sticking and moving. Good uppercut towards the tail end of the round.
The fourth round, by this time Cecilia Braekhus had found her groove. She was comfortable in there.
Even if she did look a little rusty at the start, that was a given her age and the fact that she had been away from the ring for some time, all the way back there in last year when she fought Jessica McCaskill for the second time. I figured when she returns to action this weekend,
she's got ring rust to shake off. Anybody would.
More of the same in the 5th and 6th rounds. I think that now that Cecilia Braekhus is campaigning as a junior middleweight, she could do with another 6-rounder, another 8-rounder, before so deciding to challenge either a Terry Harper or a Natasha Jonas for an alphabet title.
Things are shaking, rattling, and rolling at 154 pounds. You know, this past Friday, Mary Spencer suffered her first professional loss to Belgium's own Femke Hermans. And that changes things. It changes things for everybody.
It changes things for the champions. It changes things for Terry. It changes things for Natasha. It even changes things for Cecilia Braekhus. And it's because Mary Spencer was knocking on the door of a world title shot, of a world title opportunity. And after a while, the alphabet organizations would have likely ordered either Terry or Natasha to take her on.
But now that she's suffered her first professional loss and essentially lost her footing in the rankings, neither Natasha Jonas or Terry Harper are under pressure to face her. So they may so decide to stay at 154 pounds a little while longer.
I figured if the alphabets order either Terry or Natasha to fight Mary, they might vacate their titles and head south. Head for welterweight. But now that Mary suffered her first professional loss and lost her footing in the rankings, they're not under pressure to fight her anymore. So they may stay at 154 pounds a little while longer. Since they're not under pressure anymore, maybe one of them can share the ring with Cecilia Braekhus at some point next year. Though at some point next year, I think Cecilia should squeeze in another 6-rounder, another 8-rounder before sharing the ring with one of those 2 champions.
I think she should get back out there as soon as late January or early February to squeeze in another 6-rounder or another 8-rounder because she needs to bank those rounds.
A fight with either Terry Harper or Natasha Jonas would be a very different fight than the fight that Cecilia Braekhus had opposite the ring Jessica McCaskill, because Jessica's a pressure fighter. She's a physical, rough and tumble fighter that's going to push the pace and force you to fight, whereas Terry's going to box. So is Natasha.
They're not as physical as Jessica.
Physical fights seldom ever favor the older, more seasoned and war-torn fighter. Physical fights, generally speaking, in a general sense, they don't favor the older fighter. And that's what Jessica gave Cecilia. She gave her a physical fight.
Opposite Terry and Natasha, it'd be more of a boxing match.
With either one. And she'd likely be the betting underdog opposite the ring either one. Either Terry or Natasha. She likely would be at this point.
But if she can keep it a boxing match, she's in the fight.
And a fight with either Terry or Natasha really would be more of a boxing match than a barroom brawl, like the Jessica McCaskill fights were.
She needs to bank more rounds, though, and loosen up. She looked a bit stiff out there.
Because yesterday's fight took place on the DAZN platform, she is at minimum within arm's reach of newly crowned WBA champion Terry Harper, though I wouldn't rule out a Natasha Jonas fight.
That's a possibility as well. That could happen too, though I reiterate, yesterday's fight did take place on the DAZN platform under the Golden Boy Promotions banner.
And that does put her within proximity of Terry Harper, who may so decide to have a voluntary title defense against her.
Since it doesn't look like she's going to be having a rematch with Natasha for what would be the undisputed junior middleweight championship of the world.
If she's not under orders to satisfy any mandatory challengers by way of the WBA, she'll likely take a voluntary. And Cecilia Braekhus could very well be that voluntary.
We'll see.
We then come to the main event of the Showtime card, the Battle of the Unbeatens, the then unbeaten Michelle Rivera versus unbeaten Frank Martin. Bit of buzz around this fight leading up to it. You don't often get fights like this by way of PBC and Showtime.
Two unbeaten prospects risking their unbeaten records? No, that doesn't often happen.
Michelle Rivera, nicknamed Ali, due to what is supposed to be his resemblance to Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, was less than Ali yesterday opposite the ring. Frank Martin, who had better feet, better shot selection, better all around, just better in every department. Michelle Rivera, a very limited fighter.
Beyond the straight 1-2 from the outside coming in terms of shot selection, he had nothing. No left hook, no uppercut.
They grossly overestimated Michelle Rivera's ability to land that right hand on the premise that Frank Martin ate a lot of right hands in his last fight opposite the ring, Jackson Mariñez.
Michelle Rivera didn't land his right hand anywhere near as much, and that right hand, so many failed attempts to get that punch off. That's
the story of the fight. Frank Martin, to his credit, exhibited faster hands, faster feet, better movement, made himself a trickier target.
Too tricky for Michelle.
Once both men were in the ring, Frank Martin created that separation. He was quicker to the draw, faster hands and faster feet than Michelle Rivera, noticeable.
Better on the outside and better on the inside. On the inside, in the pocket, when he was within striking distance of Michelle Rivera, and he would let his hands go.
Those rapid-fire combinations, Michelle Rivera had no answer for those, not in the pocket, deep in the pocket.
And Frank wasn't just the faster fighter, lighter on his feet, he was also the stronger puncher. To the eye, there was more on Frank Martin's shots than Michelle Rivera's, mostly because Michelle Rivera struggled to land anything.
A lopsided affair throughout. I think the only round you could have given Michelle Rivera, conceivably, the only round you could have given him might have been the first round. But Frank Martin took control after the second round and stayed in control, even scored a knockdown.
This fight was fought in the men's lightweight division. Lightweight, that's 135 pounds. That's where Devin Haney currently reigns as that division's undisputed champion.
Vasil Lomachenko, Jermaine Ortiz, George Kambosos, former champion George Kambosos, those fighters are also there. Shakur Stevenson, he is set to be there.
Already a 2-division champion. He's shooting for 3.
Looks to become a 3-division champion once he has fully integrated himself into the men's lightweight division. There are political boundary lines to address. As much talent, the proliferation of it as there is at 135 pounds, Frank Martin, opposite the ring, any one of those fighters who are more established than he is right now.
It's not going to happen.
It isn't. Forgive me for being the party pooper, but that's the reality of boxing these days. If what you're waiting for is Frank Martin versus Devin Haney or Vasil Lomachenko or Jermaine Ortiz or Shakur Stevenson,
it's not going to happen.
So you better wake up and smell a coffee.
Wake up.
The fights that can happen for Frank, however, they are interesting enough fights. You know, he's got a great win over then unbeaten Michelle Rivera, so maybe they move him into a Rolly Romero fight or an Isaac Cruz fight. Build him up to a Gervonta Davis showdown, because those are the guys that are on his side of the street. Though as far as anything involving world titles and the overall world title picture,
well, that would require him to fight top-ranked fighters,
who are in fact all more well-established names at this weight than Frank is. Frank is entering into contender level.
That's where he is. That's where he's at. Whereas Shakur Stevenson, he's already a 2-division champion moving up in weight. Devin Haney, he is this division's undisputed champion. And the guy he's about to fight, Vasil Lomachenko, he was this division's unified champion. George also.
George Kambosos, whereas Frank ain't been a champion yet, obviously. He's an unbeaten up-and-comer. He's going from prospect into contender status.
And he did it in style yesterday. Showed good ability, good ceiling.
He's a good fighter, but I'm not holding my breath to see Frank Martin opposite the ring any one of those fighters. The fighters that are within arm's reach, Isaac Cruz,
Rolly Romero, Rayo,
Gervonta Davis when it time comes. For any fighter that the PBC has anywhere at or around these weights, the focus for those fighters seems to be landing a Gervonta Davis fight, whereas other fighters that other outfits have at or around these weights, they're focused on fighting for alphabet titles.
becoming champions.
The PBC and what other outfits are out there and what prize stallions they have in that lightweight show, they really are focused on other things. I mean, look at who Frank Martin called out post-fight.
The fans are going to want to see him in the mix with everybody else's fighters like Shakur and Devin, maybe even William Zepeda.
That's what the fans are going to start calling out for, but that's not what they're going to get. What they're going to get is PBC fighters versus PBC fighters, because that's the way it works.
You're not going to get Frank Martin versus Floyd Schofield or William Zepeda, Golden Boy fighters. You're not going to get Frank Martin versus Shakur Stevenson or Devin Haney or Sel Lomachenko, top-ranked fighters.
I mean, you're not. What you're going to get is Frank Martin versus Isaac Cruz or Rolly Romero, maybe Rayo, en route to a Gervonta Davis fight, because that's what they seem to build up all their lightweights to.
As anticlimactic as that sounds, unless the people at the PBC are prepared to send Frank Martin over to the top-ranked side of things, where the belts are, where the champions are.
The established names, the established fighters, the best in show.
Yeah, Frank racked up a pretty good win, but you got to be realistic about this thing.
Top Rank's stable of lightweights and what prize stallions they have in that lightweight show are in fact more established fighters and established names than Frank Martin or Rolly Romero or Isaac Cruz.
Best guy they've got at the PBC is a guy holding a baby belt, a secondary title to Devin Haney's full title.
They've got enough guys over there at the PBC to keep Frank Martin busy and keep him in mildly interesting fights. Though as far as the world title picture,
He's not in it.
he's a very good fighter, shows a high ceiling, but he's just not a part of that world title picture. He isn't. His handler, Errol Spence Jr., was in attendance for last night's action, and Errol Spence has said that his next fight is now likely for April, May, or June. Following a recent car crash incident, he added about Terrence Crawford, "Hopefully, I can spin that block and go back to negotiations. It's a fight I really want, so hopefully we can make it happen next year." And if his fight's been pushed back all the way to April, May, or June, they might as well revisit the Crawford fight, talks for a Crawford fight, because you shouldn't have to wait that long for Keith Thurman.
If he comes back in April, the latest, that still means that there's a year in between the Ugas unification match and what's supposed to be his next fight.
Errol Spence Jr. is by far and wide one of the most inactive fighters in the sport, one of the most inactive champions, and because he's a champion, it's a bit unethical for him to be as...
In the last 2 years, he's only fought once.
Just once. You'd never know it based on his fanatical cult of followers and how much they carry on about how he's the greatest thing since sliced bread, when in reality, the man barely fights.
He didn't fight at all last year, and he only fought once this year. He's not set to return to action until either April, May, or June of next year. That puts a year, a full calendar year, in between the Ugas fight and what's supposed to be his next fight. And the way that breaks down is one fight in the last 2 years. He's had one fight.
One fight in the last 2 years, 2 fights in the last 3, if he does end up returning to action in either April, May, or June. On a schedule like that,
It will have been over a year's time since Keith Thurman had a fight. Keith Thurman returned to action in the first quarter of this year after a 2-year layoff, a 2-year hiatus from the sport.
I think it was back in February he had the Mario Barrios fight, and if the Errol Spence Jr. fight ends up happening in either April, May, or June, it will have been over a year's time since Keith Thurman last saw action. These sparsely active, barely quasi-retired welterweights.
I don't understand what Errol Spence Jr.'s fans are so excited about. The man barely fights.
I mean, if you're a boxing fan and a fan of boxing matches, boxers that are in boxing matches, Errol Spence Jr. barely boxes.
Barely an active fighter.
Because he's barely an active boxer, barely an active fighter, in possession of 3 of the 4 alphabet titles at this weight, his absence from the division has an adverse effect on it overall, because an active champion
Who's staying active and racking up title defenses year by year.
I mean, it's better for the division and all the contenders in it. It's better for the sport. an active fighter, an active champion, you don't have to wait a year and a day to see in action.
Fucking guy's always on the rebound.
So is Keith Thurman. It's been a get-back year for the last, 5, 6 years?
What the hell are these guys fans of? Inactive boxers that barely fight?
Errol Spence Jr. said he's willing to circle the block, circle back to revisit talks for a Terrence Crawford fight. But because there's so much time in between his last fight and his next fight,
they're gonna want to give him a tune-up fight, and that's what Keith Thurman is at this point. He's little more than a tune-up fight for Errol Spence Jr., an even more inactive fighter than Errol is.
the only guy more inactive than Errol at this point is Keith.
Where Errol has only fought once in the last 2 years, Keith Thurman has only fought once in the last 3. He sat out all of 2020, all of 2021. He came back earlier this year against Mario Barrios, but that was all he did.
And if you think that you can be away from the sport that long, for that amount of time, on a regular basis and stay sharp, not staying active, then you really don't know how this works. You really don't understand the sport of boxing.
Keith Thurman is a tune-up fight.
I mean, yeah, maybe in 2016 and 2017 he was a top-level welterweight, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but here today he's a transient. He's a quasi-retired fighter who's barely active, and the way it works is the more you do something, the better you become at it, but the less you do it...
You really need that explained to you.
You want I should hold your hand and walk you through why being away from the sport this often, for these long periods of time, has an adverse effect on a fighter, an athlete?
You can't put 2 and 2 together on your own?
Errol's fans would have us rank Errol Spence Jr., the fighter, alongside other fighters, other boxers, other champions that are far more active than he is. And I don't know how you guys' pound-for-pound lists works, but activity...
How frequently the fighter fights, how frequently the champion gets out there and defends his status as a champion, that's pretty important on my list, and Errol's losing ground.
Losing it fast. He is quite literally the least active fighter, the least active champion on the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list. If Artur Beterbiev is successful in early next year opposite the ring Anthony Yarde, and he racks up another successful title defense, he's going to move ahead of Errol. Right now, he's ranked right behind him.
And bear in mind that in some ways, Artur is just as injury-prone as Errol, but even he's
Still a busier fighter than Errol. He at least fought last year and this year.
It's the way that breaks down.
It's the way that works. The bottom line here is we're not going to see Errol again for some time.
Opposite the ring, Keith Thurman or anybody else.